Okay, we seem to have stabilized. Well, I'm Steve Orleans, president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and I'm thrilled today to have my friend Ryan Haas talk about his new book called Stronger. It is in this time when there's so much discussion of China that is not fact-based, that is not data-based, that is ideological. Ryan has written this extraordinary book, really a wonderful read about what our policy towards China should be. It's stronger because basically, Ryan, I think on mighty is you want to make America stronger, and that should be the thrust of our policies, and that will help us compete with China. It is absolutely a must read. If you're interested in U.S.-China relations, it's just a must read. There is no excuse for not reading this. I'm not going to go over Ryan's full bio, except to say he's the Michael Armacost Chair in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. I think a lot of us dealt with Ryan when he was the Director of China, Mongolia, and Taiwan Affairs at the NSC in the second Obama administration. And before that was at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. But it's wonderful to be joined by someone when I agree so much with their views. But let me just start off with the question, which is, Ryan, why this book and why now?
Well, first of all, Steve, thank you for allowing me to join you today for this conversation. It's really an honor for me to be with you. The reason I wrote the book, I have to confess, was not to become rich or famous. We all know it's axiomatic that fear sells. I've sort of made a case for the opposite of fear, that I've made a case for confidence, that the United States can and should approach its relationship with China from a position of confidence that's born of an awareness of our strengths. And that a confident approach towards China will allow us to approach the relationship in a more calm, cool-headed, wise, long-term way. And part of the reason why I wrote the book was because in recent years, I've grown increasingly concerned that we've lost some of our confidence in our dealings with China. I first encountered this during a transition briefing at Trump Tower in December 2017, when we were handing off the policy baton to our counterparts in the Trump administration. And they expressed a high degree of anxiety about whether the United States will continue to exist, as an entity 50 or 100 years from now. And I was just stunned that how we could be so anxious and insecure about our own standing in our relationship with China. I watched the national security strategy of the Trump administration come about, which framed the relationship in highly adversarial terms. And then I saw a really reactive, defensive, anxious approach to the U.S.-China relationship take hold in the years that followed. And so that was the backdrop in which I wrote the book. I wrote it in 2019, and it closed in early 2020. My writing for it closed. And it was really just at its most basic level intended to try to provide a different, more confident framework for the way that we approach our long-term competitive relationship with China.
It sounds a lot like the way the Biden administration talks about China, that it's kind of build back better, that we need to strengthen, we need to focus first on what's going on in the United States, then focus on our alliances, then deal with China. Is that an accurate statement?
To a certain extent. I mean, I have to be totally transparent about the fact that when I wrote the book, Joe Biden was placing 4th in the Iowa caucus. It was very unclear who was going to win the Democratic primary, let alone the 2020 election. So I certainly wasn't writing in anticipation of any specific electoral outcome. And in a way, I think that sort of freed me up to write what I really believed. And, I served in the previous administration with many people who occupy senior positions of this current administration. Avril Haines, Bill Burns, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, and others. And so I'm sure that the experiences that we shared and the lessons that they provided to me influenced my thinking and my writing, and hopefully in some small way, the same is true in reverse. But if this seems cliche, then I've done my job. If this is all conventional wisdom now, then that's great, because at the time that I was writing this, it certainly was far from it.
You talk in the book about that experience briefing some of the folks on the Trump transition team, who basically cut you off and said, China's an existential threat. We have to do what there is to win. And early in the book, it's a great anecdote. Can you say who that person was?
Oh, I'd prefer not to identify them by name, other than to say that they occupied a senior position in the White House for a period of time.
How did that make you feel? I mean, here you've been working, you worked at the embassy, you worked kind of for Obama, and suddenly they're kind of saying, we're throwing out what you've done.
Yeah, it was a stunning exchange because it ran so far from the mindset and approach that we had to the relationship. And it made it very clear that there would be a very dramatic and sharp shift in the conduct of American policy towards China in the years to come.
You talk about AIIB. I had very little disagreement with the Obama administration. I did have disagreement with the decision not to join AIIB, and you were at the NSC at that time. You say in the book, it sought to displace existing Western institutions. So my question would be how? And do you think in retrospect that analysis at the time was wrong?
Well, look, I think that if there were opportunities for do-overs, we would certainly ask for one on AIIB. It was a mistake. It was rolled out poorly. It was communicated ineffectively. But here's what was happening, Steve. We all knew that there was zero chance that Congress would allocate funding for the United States to join AIIB. So our membership was not an available option to us. We were focused on laying the groundwork and building the case for passage of the Trans-Pacific Partnership at that time, and having a drawn-out discussion about the merits of joining AIIB would have really muddied that picture. We also had genuine questions about how AIIB would function. How independent would it be from Beijing? What would it uphold certain safeguards and standards that had become normal with other multilateral development banks? And how would it interact with other multilateral development banks? And there was a philosophical question about whether or not we would have more influence by withholding our membership until we gained clarity and confidence on some of these fundamental questions, or whether we would have more influence by being inside the tent, so to speak, and working from within. And different countries reached different judgments on that. It all sort of played out in the press in a very unhelpful way. And so it definitely could have been managed better, and I wish it would have been.
Did we actually try and persuade allies not to join?
No, we never threatened any country with consequences if they chose to join, or really put a strong arm to them not to. We shared our views and our concerns and our questions, and asked that they reinforce them in their own way. And each country chose to do so in its own manner.
Yeah, should we, in the Biden administration, try and join AIIB? The Chinese have said in meetings I've had with Chairman Jin that they're still holding a seat at the table for us.
It wouldn't bother me in the least to see the United States inside the tent at AIIB.
In the book, you say she extinguished any hope of political reform. Any hope, but we are seeing political reform in some areas. We're seeing a much more transparent judiciary. I visited the Supreme Court of China, and they have a remarkable place where every single case that is filed is put up on a board, and you can kind of go and see what the pleadings look like. Is that fair to say that they've extinguished all hope of political reform? And first that question, then I'll have a follow-up.
Well, I think that in the near term, we should probably have modest expectations about the pace and direction of political reform. My view is that we have enough data points to draw a trend line in terms of how Xi Jinping would like to govern China at this point. He's been in power for over 8 years. And it's clear that he wants to consolidate control. It's clear that he wants to have a highly disciplined approach of carrying out the decisions that are reached at the very top, and that there is a real concentration of power around him. And so I don't expect that that's going to change. Yes, we can find certain data points that deviate from that trend, but the overall direction seems pretty clear at this point. Now, I would say, and I think that this is in agreement with you, Steve, that what is happening now, the snapshot of 2021, doesn't necessarily have to be what happens into eternity. China will change. Xi Jinping is not going to have a iron fist grip of control in China forever. And I expect that over time, there will be adjustments and recalibrations. I can't tell you whether that'll be in 5 years or 25, but I'm very confident it will happen.
Yeah, I mean, I've lived through a lot of pendulum swings in China. I guess I'm old, but I arrived there in '79 and watched Democracy Wall get taken down. I watched the loosenings. I watched June 4th. I watched Deng's Southern Trip. I've seen all of the back and forths, and I think it's very important that policymakers understand your point that China is not static, and China is also not monolithic. And yes, President Xi is exercising all kinds of control, but there are lots of folks who are bringing different ideas up to him. Corruption has obviously been a focus of President Xi. Is part of the digital currency initiative to end corruption in China? If everything is digital and there's a record at PBOC, obviously you have no privacy, but there's also no way to get money. It's very difficult to get money to a government official without there being a record.
Well, the world would be a better place if the digital yuan eradicated corruption inside China. I think it'll probably squeeze out some of the corruption, but I still expect that it will be a feature of the system as long as there is not an independent judiciary or a free press. It's going to be very hard, absent those tools, for the Chinese system to squeeze out corruption. And we also have to contend with the fact that there is corruption that takes place in non-monetary units as well, whether it be jewelry or offshore assets or other things.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that must have been frustrating from having left the NSC and gone over to Brookings, to hear this talk about bilateral trade deficits and the loss of jobs in the United States. And the book really, I think, analyzes that and brings real economists in to give real data. Why do the American people not agree with you and me? I mean, I agree with you. I think economists agree, but if the American people, I don't know if it's been polled, would say that we've lost all these jobs to China, millions and millions of jobs. Why is that? And what should we do?
Well, I think what we should do is have our leaders tell the truth, level with the American people. The reality as I see it, and as economists explain it to me, is that Americans have benefited broadly from expanded trade with China. We have increased by a huge margin our ability to sell items into the fastest growing market in the world. Our companies have grown significantly. Our consumers have much more purchasing power now than they did 30 years ago because products have gone down in price that we purchase and consume. But the effects of all of this have been very concentrated in certain geographic parts of the country that have been hit hard and have really lost the heartbeat of their local economies. And we haven't done a very good job as a country in helping those areas that have been most hardly hit. And so what I would love to see us do is to be clear about this. Just be straightforward. It doesn't help us to ignore the problem, nor does it help us to weaponize it as a tool for political expediency. We need to solve it because trade with China or with other countries is not going away. So what do? I think that we need to invest in education. I think we need to really put a lot of emphasis into STEM training. We need to create incentives for companies to invest in these areas of the country that have been hit hard. And we need to prioritize this as an issue because if we don't, we're going to have this two-speed economy that's really going to put stress on the fabric of our society.
But why?
But I'd love to hear your thoughts, Steve, because you've been thinking about this for a long time as well.
I get to interview you today. It's why to talk about bilateral trade deficits and to have people believe that that's meaningful is really quite extraordinary to me. If you took economics 101 at any university, you would learn that it's about savings rates. And it's really shocking that the American people have come to believe that that trade deficit has taken jobs from America. I think in part, it's part of disinformation that is just pervading in America. If you tell a lie enough times, it begins to be believed, and that's really that's very scary. What do you do about it? Exactly what you say. You try and tell the truth and have people who really understand speak, which is what the National Committee tries to do. We vet our speakers very carefully, and we make sure that they're qualified to talk about what they talk about, which leads to an interesting question about China. You suggest that the Chinese leadership is insecure and that polling data is inaccurate in China. That's not what a bunch of folks, especially folks at Harvard, think. They publish their polls that show enormous support for the Chinese leadership among the people of China. Talk about why you think the polling is inaccurate on China.
Well, Steve, my views on this are informed by my conversations with Chinese leaders and Chinese experts and people who are inside the Chinese system, who in moments of candor will acknowledge that they don't have confidence in their understanding of what popular views are inside of China. They don't have the rhythms of regular elections that we do to provide feedback. They don't have a free press that really digs into problems and tries to expose problems. And they don't have reliable polling. I certainly don't want to cast aspersions on our friends at Harvard. I would just say that in talking with our friends inside the Chinese government, they will tell you that they do things like monitor Weibo to get a feel for what the mood is inside China. That is not a reflection of a government that has a precise understanding of where the public attitudes are.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yes, the monitoring is certainly of Weibo. It would be the equivalent of determining where the United States is by looking at Twitter,
right.
which would not be a very wise approach.
I think that would give us a pretty skewed picture.
Yeah, you've got great section on the South China Sea. You say in part, Beijing, there has demonstrated is not benign and passive. But you don't kind of put it in the context of what the United States has done in terms of potentially violating international law and the consequences of that. When I have been early on, partly I was an international lawyer at the very beginning of my career. And when you get a judgment, as you did in the Philippine tribunal, I've been very categorical in stating that China has acted in violation of international law in its South China Sea policies. And I get huge pushback. One of the pushbacks that I get is, you guys the Americans violated international law in your invasion of Iraq. And hundreds of thousands of people died. Ours, nobody has even died. So keep some perspective. How do you respond to that?
Well, the Chinese, they talk about it, at least with me, in terms of great power exemptions. The United States exempts itself from international rules when it serves its purposes or its requirements to do so. And they get frustrated that the United States doesn't grant the same latitude or leeway to the Chinese when they feel like it serves their requirements to do so, for example, in the South China Sea. Look, we just have to own the fact that, yes, in our history, we have been less than perfect. We like to think that we have acted for noble purposes, whether it be protecting innocent civilians or dealing with injustices. But yes, we have acted outside of the system at times. On the South China Sea, though, I guess, Steve, the way that I think about it, and I may be in a minority on this view, but that we sort of did ourselves a bit of a disservice by allowing this issue to become such a contest of great power wills, where every Chinese action needed to be responded to with a commensurate American military reaction. And in the absence of it, we would appear feckless in the face of China's march. That wasn't the space that we should have found ourselves in. What I hope that we can do going forward is sort of refocus this discussion around what can be done to uphold key principles that have enabled the long peace in Asia for so long. Respect for international law, peaceful resolution of disputes, diplomatic flexibility and compromise to manage intractable challenges. These are the things that have undergirded and underpinned peace in Asia for so long. And the more that we can sort of find ourselves on that ground, I think the stronger position we will be in to put pressure on China, either to find ways to mellow its approach, or to, sort of self-identify as standing apart from it and the regional consensus.
If China signed a code of conduct, would that be good enough with the states that are concerned in there?
Well, I think a meaningful code of conduct that bound all parties together would probably be a step in the right direction.
You spend a lot of time in the book talking about human rights and kind of trying to put it, obviously it's our values, but what should be our red line on human rights? If the Chinese do X, we do Y. How do we handle that? It's so difficult. Secretary Blinken has characterized Chinese activities in Xinjiang as genocide. That actually diverts attention from the bad policies. It's because now there's a discussion of whether or not it's genocide. It appears my former office in the State Department said, well, it's probably not. That's the legal advisor's office. But that diverts attention from actually the truly terrible policies that China is implementing there. So how do we deal with that as a foreign policy matter?
Yeah, I'm not hugely enthusiastic about the use of the term red lines, but I do think that it is a reality that as repression continues in places like Xinjiang, it is going to color public attitudes in the United States towards China and our perceptions of China as a society. And that is going to affect the political space in which the relationship operates. But I agree with, I think, the underlying sentiment, Steve, that what's happening is, it impacts how we look at the world and who we are as a people. We're bound together by our values, not by shared ethnicity or blood, and we can't afford to turn away from what we're watching.
How do we encourage China to be more You talk about it, encourage China to be more responsive to its citizens. How do we do that?
I wish that I had a really smart, snappy answer to that question, but I have a few thoughts. I think that one way that we put pressure upon the leadership in China is through the power of our own example. The more that we're living up to our ideals and the values, the more the contrast becomes clear when China does not. I think that it also helps when we can establish that we're pursuing these issues because we just deeply, fundamentally, philosophically care about them, not because we want to use them as a weapon to undermine the Chinese Communist Party or tarnish China's image on the world stage. And, I think that one of the most impactful decisions that we made over the past 10 or 15 years on human rights issues was very tangential. It was adjacent to human rights. It was putting an air quality monitor on the ceiling or the roof of the U.S. Embassy and broadcasting that air quality index to American citizens so that they were aware and their kids could be aware of whether it was safe for them to go outside and play in the playground during the day. What it did was it catalyzed this discussion inside China about why don't they have information about air quality in Beijing or in Shanghai or in Chengdu or in Chongqing or Guangzhou. And it led to a broad awareness of things like AQI and particulate matters in the air. And it has had a catalytic effect on spurring progress towards improving air quality in China. I'm tremendously proud of the small role that the United States played in sort of helping set that in motion. And so the question that I always am asking myself is, what is the next air quality monitor? How do we find those opportunities for progress? And I also think it's important for us not to think about human rights in a binary good versus bad, where we bend China either as being good or being bad. It's a continuum. It's a continuum for every country. And trying to find opportunities to make progress where progress is possible, hopefully will build momentum and help push the Chinese to being more responsive to the ambitions and demands of their citizens.
Yeah. You talk in the book about kind of areas where the United States, especially the UN, where the United States and China work together, the Balkans, Panama, Haiti, Iraq. I would have added Darfur and China's role in peacekeeping, which has been truly remarkable, the most peacekeepers of any of the P5. Why does nobody know that? You tell people that and they say, really?
Yeah, it's a underappreciated story, no question. I think part of the reason why is because, like we were talking about at the start, fear sells. The idea of steady progress among diplomats and trying to lessen problems around the world isn't the most exciting, eye-catching story, as much as I wish it were as a former diplomat myself. But it's a story that needs to be told because it's important. It underlines the fact that the past 40 years were not just an abject failure, that there was real, substantive, concrete progress that was achieved through hard work. And much of it was incremental. There wasn't, these great epiphany moments or breakthroughs. There rarely are. I mean, diplomacy by its very nature is an exercise in compromise. The only times when the United States has gotten everything that it wanted was in situations of unconditional surrender, which occurred twice over the past 100 years at the end of World War II with Japan and Germany. Every other instance has been, an exercise in compromise. But in that process, we have built some pretty strong muscle memory around the global financial crisis in 2008, the outbreak of Ebola in 2014 or 2015, Iran issues, helping to bring about the JCPOA. The United States and China have cooperated in very meaningful ways, and we need to regain some of that muscle memory going forward.
What's the lesson from, you were there for it, the discussion between President Xi and President Obama about stopping China from cyber attacks, which were used for commercial benefits for Chinese organizations, Chinese corporations. So what's the lesson for today in that whole process?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. It's probably underappreciated. For many years, the United States had been raising concerns about China's cyber activities, and they'd largely gone unheeded. And in the run-up to President Xi's state visit in 2015, we informed the Chinese that we had reached the end of our rope, so to speak, and that we would have to begin imposing penalties to address our serious concerns that had gone unaddressed. And it was at that time that the Chinese decided to dispatch Meng Jianju, who was the security czar at the time for Xi Jinping, to Washington 2 weeks before the state visit to negotiate an agreement for how to address cyber issues so that they could be managed within a diplomatic framework. We went into that negotiation with a list of 5 or 6 things that we considered to be essential. We walked out of that negotiating room at 4 a.m. With agreement on all 5 or 6 of those things. And for the period from the agreement until the end of the Obama administration, the deal largely held. Now, elements of it were subjective. We were talking about government-sponsored, cyber-enabled espionage for commercial gain. And so there were instances when we would try to develop a more precise definition of where that boundary was for commercial gain. But that was a conversation that was being had. We also were gaining confidence that when we brought cases to their attention, that they would be addressed and vice versa. So it was a period when we were working to take problems off the table. And contrary to the public narrative, there was actually some progress that was being achieved that was observable and measurable.
And then what happened?
Well, I left government in 2017, so I can't tell the rest of the story, I'm afraid. But based upon what we've read from public accounts, both sides appear to have stepped away in their own respects. I think that from an American perspective, we hold China accountable for walking away from the deal. From the Chinese perspective, they argue that we suspended or unwound the dialogue mechanisms that were an element of the agreement, and that we had taken a step back from it as well. Either way, it's sort of water under the bridge at this point. It's disappointing that progress that was achieved, that was hard fought, has been unwound. I hope going forward that we will be able to build upon and improve upon the foundation that was set.
That was going to be my next question, which is, should the Biden administration move forward to reinstate this kind of agreement? Is it still, we don't even know if it's still going on.
Yeah, I don't know where the conversation stands, but if it is not being addressed, I would argue that it should be. We don't lose anything by trying to hold Chinese to account for agreements that they make with us. They made an agreement with the United States government, not with Barack Obama, and so we should hold them to account, and we should work to build on it, because look, cyber issues are only going to grow in importance as more of our world and our existence becomes digital.
Where was Huawei when you were at the NSC? What was kind of the view of Huawei? And then talk about the procedure by which an extradition request is processed. Does it go, it's just the Justice Department action, or does it go through state or NSC?
Well, when I was at the National Security Council, Huawei was certainly an issue on our radar. It was a subject of our attention and a subject of our concern. And we may have slightly different views on this, but I think that there's solid grounds to have concern about Huawei operating in systems of close security partners of ours or neighbors of ours, and that we are within our rights to try to protect ourselves, in part because of concerns about information security, and in part just because of the nature of Huawei's technology. It's a little bit porous. So that was where we were. The concern about Huawei was not a Trump phenomenon. It's something that the Trump administration inherited. And it's a concern that I think the Biden administration will remain attentive to as well. On your latter question about extradition requests, I never was in a situation where there was a request to detain an executive of a foreign company that was transiting an airport, so I have no experience to draw from on that. But I don't know if in your days at the legal advisor's office that ever crossed your desk.
It did. It was what I call a ministerial function. So there was, you just check that the documentation was proper, and then you just process. It was requests from countries that had extradition treaties with us for us to detain a person. If we had the extradition treaty, it was ministerially. There was no true substantive analysis, at least in my experience, no substantive analysis. Should we reevaluate where we are with Huawei? Should we, we're obviously punishing U.S. chip makers significantly. There was some discussion that the Department of Defense does not agree with these strict limits on exports of chips because it's reducing profitability of U.S. chip makers, and it will reduce, therefore, their R&D. But should we just shrug and say this is national security? Let's just move on.
Well, my view, Steve, is that American policy is not going to destroy Huawei. Huawei is going to continue to exist whether we like them or not. And if Huawei moves into things like building batteries for electric vehicles inside China, that's not the worst outcome in the world for us. But on the broader point that you're making, I very much agree that it's in our interest for our semiconductor companies to remain at the cutting edge of innovation. In order for them to remain at the cutting edge of innovation, they need to have robust research and development budgets. In order for them to be able to afford robust research and development budgets, they need to have markets to sell to. And if they don't have China, the leading growth engine of the world, as a market to sell to, then we're going to have problems. Someone else is going to have to pick up that slack. Many people offer the United States taxpayer as the solution. I'm not sure that there are a lot of people that are super enthusiastic about subsidizing semiconductor R&D budgets with our own taxpayer dollars. So there is a healthy balance to be struck, for sure. I don't think we've reached it yet, but I'm less concerned about selling non-cutting edge chips to China. They're going to purchase them anyways, and I would just assume that they'd be able to help our companies advance their own innovation in the process.
Do you think we pushed China down the path of indigenous innovation with respect to chips, that the tens of billions of dollars they're spending were because the United States basically told them, you can't rely on us as a supplier? And would we have been better off just not lobbing that shell at them and saying, you better do it yourself because you can't trust us?
Yeah, it's an important question that we're going to have to unpack over the course of the coming years. I'm not sure that anyone can reach a definitive judgment yet, given the information we have available to us. My own judgment is that the Xi administration was pretty committed to the path of indigenous innovation by themselves, and this probably dates back to the revelations from the fellow who left and went to Russia, if not before. So this was already a train that had left the station. We may have accelerated the velocity that train was traveling on, but I don't think that we pushed it out of the station.
Yeah, I always had, this was a very non-traditional view, but I always believed we should have been selling military equipment to China so they would be dependent upon U.S. military equipment. And that if they're dependent, that actually reduces any possible strategic competition. But that was not shared by my friends in the U.S. military. So that way back when, well, before in the 80s, I think Grumman had sold F-16s to China, which then, as a result of June 4th, the sale got canceled. And I'm not sure if we ever refunded the money, but it was certainly, we were actually moving down that road, and then it was derailed by June 4th. Why hasn't the Biden administration, you have a great piece of data in the book, which is 60% of America's most highly valued technology companies were founded by immigrants or children of immigrants. It's just a fabulous piece of data, one which I was not aware of. Why has the Biden administration not completely overturned these visa policies that they were put in after you left the NSC?
I don't know the answer, but I hope that they get around to it soon, because I fundamentally believe that openness is one of America's great strengths in our competition with China or any other country. It is a differentiating factor. It allows us to be a sponge for the best ideas and brightest minds from around the world. And it makes me think about a famous quote from Lee Kuan Yew, the former leader of Singapore, who said, "Of course, China would like to surpass the United States. The challenge is that China can only rely upon the talents of its own people, whereas the United States gets to rely upon the talents of the world." And I think that it's a simple but profound statement, because it really speaks to part of what makes us who we are, but also part of what makes us so strong, is that we have this constant replenishment of talent into our system. And I hope that we get back to attracting it.
But it gets to a different question, a similar, related question, but different, is why has the Biden administration not reversed a lot of these policies, which I see as kind of low-hanging fruit? Obviously the visa policies, we haven't reinstated Fulbright. Congressional staff trips are still not allowed. Tariffs are still in place. Consulates are still closed. Entity list still seems to be pretty arbitrary. What's going on here?
Well, I think that they are about 100 days into their term. They still don't have key officials in place yet. The Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, the person who really has day-to-day custody over the management of the relationship, has not yet been confirmed. So I'm willing to grant them a little bit of leeway on this score. You have identified a series of continuities, and if I may, let me just add a few discontinuities to balance out the picture. First, there is no longer the efforts to demonize the Chinese Communist Party or drive wedges between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people.
But Chinese Communist Party members still can't be granted visas to the United States.
There is no longer the same efforts to pin all blame for all domestic problems upon the Chinese Communist Party. Joe Biden, this is second, Joe Biden has made a very clear distinction between China as a competitor and not as an adversary or an enemy. I think that this is a subtle but important distinction. A competitor is someone that you want to outpace in order to outcompete. An adversary or enemy is someone who you feel the need to harm in order to protect yourself. Both Joe Biden and Xi Jinping have acknowledged that it is proper and necessary for two powers to cooperate even as they compete. It's a departure, again, from the Trump administration. And there have been cautious but steady efforts to rebuild some of the channels of communication that exist between Washington and Beijing, whether it be on climate issues, as we saw last week with John Kerry, or Afghanistan, or Myanmar, or Iran. So yes, things have not moved as quickly as I think you or I would have hoped. But you know, there are subtle but significant changes that I think are afoot.
Yeah, I remain, as you, I know all the people, work with most of them, and I remain optimistic that necessary changes will be made. But I worry that the narrative, the Chinese government does its best to make the narrative in the United States extremely difficult. So it's tough to do anything. And I worry that it's not static, that, China is moving, and it's not moving in a constructive direction, in my view. And partly that's because there was some expectation that things would improve after Biden became president. And the continuities, yes, you're right in what you pointed out, but the continuities far exceed the changes.
Yeah, I think you've raised a good point. I think we're struggling with a bit of a challenge in expectation management. There are some in Washington, I wouldn't associate myself with this, but there were some who hoped that Beijing would moderate its behavior in areas of concern to us as a way to create space for an improvement in the relationship. And really, we haven't seen much of that. The situation with Taiwan has become more tense. Xinjiang has not gotten any better. Hong Kong has gotten worse. Australia is suffering under pressure from Beijing. Perhaps one area where things have softened slightly is on the China-India border, but that's the exception that sort of proves the rule. And then from Beijing's perspective, I think that they had expectations as well that you described that have been unrealized. And as you said, I worry that both sides will begin to reach conclusions that neither is serious about taking steps to improve the relationship. And we will find ourselves sort of locking into a dynamic that isn't healthy for either.
Partly because way back when I always say the xiao tu dou, I was the small potato in creating the unofficial relationship with Taiwan when I was in the State Department in the late 70s. And I consider it probably the most important thing I ever did in my life, because I'd been a student in Taiwan in 1972 and felt very close. And the success of that policy is remarkable. It's really one of the great American foreign policy successes of my lifetime, that we have peace, stability, economic and social integration, and we had for a long time no real serious issues in cross trades. The Trump administration has thrown out policies with respect to official contact. They have been salami slicing the Chinese by upping official contact more and more, sending a uniformed admiral, sending Secretary Azar, sending others, throwing out the rules with respect to that the State Department has with respect to official contact. I was surprised to see Secretary Blinken reaffirm those rules with respect to how we deal with Taiwan representatives in the United States. And Chinese response seems to me to be a response to that because we're changing the rules slightly, that we're salami slicing, cross-strait relations, they're responding very aggressively, overly aggressively. How should the Biden administration be dealing with that?
Well, I agree that there's a action-reaction dynamic that has taken shape in the Taiwan Strait. Both sides believe that they're reacting to the actions of the other. There has been a growing discussion in Washington about how close are we to risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. I'm less concerned than some about the military dimension of the challenge, but I'm more concerned than others about the non-military coercive challenge that Taiwan confronts. Because the reality every day is that Taiwan is facing increasing diplomatic isolation, increasing economic pressure, cyber operations, interference operations inside their own political system. And it appears to be an effort to try to wear down the psychological confidence of the people of Taiwan in their future. and try to establish that Taiwan is on its own in dealing with the mainland, and that its only path to peace or prosperity is to welcome the embrace of Beijing. And so, from my perspective, I think that a steady, clear, firm approach by the United States that remains within the bounds of our longstanding One China policy is the right place to be. I think that it is in our interest for the people of Taiwan to feel safe and confident in their future, to feel like that they can enjoy dignity and respect on the world stage, that they're capable of maintaining a cutting-edge, innovative capability inside their society, and also that they're able to diversify trade and investment links with others around the world. That will stabilize them and help them feel more confident in their future. And I think it will also serve to the benefit of the United States and our interest in peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah, Mort Holbrook, who I think you probably know, who knows Taiwan quite well, says, what's the point of the Biden administration following Trump's lead in pushing U.S. ties with Taiwan ever closer to, quote, two Chinas, with the visit of the U.S. ambassador to Palau? What next?
Well, I don't know what's next. If I did, I'd tell you, but I don't. The reality is that we are in a tense situation, and it's time for just some clear, straight conversations about what the intentions are of each side's actions, and what they perceive to be responding to. Because right now, I think that we are doing a lot of intuiting of what the other side is trying to do. Both sides believe that the other is moving the ball, so to speak. A lot of people in Washington believe that Beijing is ratcheting up pressure on Taiwan and really accelerating the pace at which it seeks to compel Taiwan to unify. And many people in Beijing certainly have a different perspective. The reality, though, is that neither Washington nor Beijing benefits from allowing the situation to spiral out, and neither do the people of Taiwan.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the 24 million people of Taiwan are going to be decisive to questions about their future, not us or anyone else. And so the more that the burden is on Beijing to provide an attractive offering to the people of Taiwan and to try to persuade them about the direction that they would like to see Taiwan's future, that's to everyone's benefit. To the extent that we are sort of shadow boxing each other, I don't think that it benefits anyone.
Yeah, I think the question which you raise is this China's plan, or is this reaction to what we're doing? And I wrestle with that question all the time. And, you know, I had people chart the overflights by the mainland fighters and bombers to actions by the United States. And there is a correlation, which is distressing. Well, it means it's fixable. But let's go on. From our brilliant intern, Kathy Huang, you've had experience sitting next to many top CCP officials, including Li Jianshu. Can you offer an insider's view on what you see as Beijing's strategies and goals approaching U.S. China relations? That's from literally the personal contact that you have. Some organizations, such as the National Endowment for Democracy, have claimed China's ambition is to export its authoritarian model abroad. Do you agree?
My general view is that Beijing would like to have its political and economic model respected. It would like to be the leading power in Asia and a leading power on the world stage. And it would like to have its core interests respected. The question, though, or the challenge that we run up against is that in the process of trying to gain respect for their political and economic model, China appears to be making more and more efforts to degrade or undermine the appeal of democratic models. And we see this with increasing frequency from our friends in Beijing. And it concerns me because it's unlearning a lesson that the Chinese were so committed to having learned at the end of the Cold War, which is that it's not the China's advantage to allow this rivalry to become more and more ideological. I think today, compared to 5 years ago and compared to 10 years ago, the ideological edge of the relationship is sharper. I don't think that serves either side's interest, and we're going to have to see. The thing that I'm struggling with, Steve, and I'd love your perspective on this, is that China really had a formula that enabled its rise, that served it so well for so long. maintaining a benign periphery, keeping a generally stable relationship with the United States, steadily reforming and opening, and being cautious about assuming undue burdens on the world stage. And on all four of those lines, China has deviated from the course that it was on for the 40 years of its momentous rise. And so I think that that's sort of undergirds the question that Kathy is asking about whether or not something has changed fundamentally.
Yeah, and I think the views of Chinese, I think, again, I always go back to the story that was told to me by the equivalent of the national security advisor from China, which is Obama gets up in the morning and he's briefed on Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, all Venezuela. Xi Jinping gets up in the morning and he's briefed on Guangzhou, Tibet, Xinjiang. China's focus is inward, and its history has always been to focus inward. So the idea that it is seeking to export its model, I think, is simply, you can find scholars to advocate, who advocate anything, but that the government is truly trying to do this, I don't agree with that. They are totally focused on internal security. And I think I always look at their defense budget. It's smaller than their internal security budget. That ain't true in the United States. Maybe it should be, given that our threats have now become very much internal. But the Chinese are worried about threats from China, not threats from abroad. To the extent that something abroad flows into China, they then react abroad.
Yeah.
So when they seek to stifle academics, it's academics who they believe are affecting potential independence movements in China. And that's kind of what they worry about. Now, they shouldn't do it. Nobody is excusing it, but you need to understand what generates a response from them.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think of the 50 issues that Xi Jinping gets briefed on every morning, I would argue that at least 45 of them are domestic. And if China's aspiration is to export a China model, you'll have to persuade me where they will have purchase in doing so. It doesn't seem to be the most attractive model for exports to anywhere, particularly the areas that know China best, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore. They are not clamoring to embrace or import China's political model.
I agree. James Cranny, president of the California Citrus Quality Control. Can you imagine China and the United States returning to a normalization of trade that would essentially exclude two-way technology trade, but allow other sectors to resume normal trade, including removal of Section 301 and 232 tariffs? Obviously, he's concerned about citrus exports to China.
As I would be too if I had his job. I guess I would rate this situation or scenario as possible, but not high probability. My sense is that technology is it's a key engine of the U.S. economy. There's a lot of knowledge production that's taking place still today between the United States and China. I don't expect that the United States will simply abandon technology as an issue in the relationship. And I also don't see much near-term likelihood that the United States will roll back restrictions to pre-Trump levels within the coming months. So my expectation for the time being is that the Biden administration will keep the Phase 1 trade deal intact until it expires early next year. But I hope that they use that time productively, both in a U.S. China context, but also in a regional context, to try to build some momentum around an affirmative agenda, whether it's on digital trade or WTO reform, but also to try to knit together efforts with our allies and partners around the world so that we are working in a coordinated direction to try to encourage China down the reform path on issues, whether it be subsidies or market access or tech transfer that are of concern to all of us.
Sounds like the Biden administration. You say in the book, China has found a way to get inside the EU tent. But what about the recent EU decision sanctioning Chinese officials? I think the Chinese may have expected that was not going to get through, but then it did. Does that suggest more unity in the EU against some of these policies of China than you expected?
Well, I think that the coordinated action by the EU and the United States and a few others to implement sanctions on Xinjiang related issues exceeded Beijing's expectations in a way that they were quite displeased by. And it also, I don't think that they were prepared for the unity of effort that took place. And from my perspective, I think that Beijing overreacted and overresponded in a way that will be long-term disadvantageous to them. I'm not yet prepared to say that that the comprehensive agreement on investment is dead or alive. I think that there's a long ways to go in that story, and we should probably have a little bit of patience to watch how things play out. The fact that the French and German leaders are still meeting directly and speaking directly with Xi on a whole host of issues that are adjacent to that suggests that at least they don't appear to have given up on the idea either.
You have the Biden administration obviously is focusing a bit on the Quad, Australia, Japan, India, and the United States. You are pretty skeptical in the book. Tell the audience why.
Well, my concern with the Quad when I wrote this in 2019 and early 2020 was that the form was outpacing the substance, and that it was not a cost-free proposition for us. In other words, to the extent that the United States, Australia, Japan, and India appear to be sitting at a grown-up table deciding the fate of issues in the region, it creates a lot of external effects for us with other partners that matter significantly, whether it's Vietnam or Korea or others. But it also puts stress on the idea of the role of ASEAN in the region. And so that was the basis of my concern. I've been very pleased with the early actions of the Biden administration on the Quad. I think that the fact that they were able to focus on affirmative issues that matter to the people in the region is significant. And the three areas that they identified were climate, technology, and COVID response. To the extent that that they're able to pool resources and bring other countries that are affected into working together and building this dense network of relationships in the region, that's to the best. And if it creates a race to the top dynamic where China tries to outcompete Quad countries on, let's say, COVID vaccine distribution, then the world's a better place. So I'm very comfortable with the direction that the Biden administration is taking things at the moment.
The book, would you say the book represents a majority view or a minority view today?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I certainly hope that it represents a majority view. My general.
I'm actually not sure if it's not outside the consensus in Washington today.
Well, I think it's probably outside the consensus in Washington. The question is whether or not it's reflective of views broadly across the United States. And I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
Polling is very negative on China, incredibly negative on China, lowest in history.
Correct.
And you're trying to put nuance in the discussion.
Correct. So there's plenty of work left to do on this score, and I appreciate conversations like the one that we're having today to help do that. But my general sense, and you can look at this in something that Jake Sullivan and others wrote when they did a extensive study on foreign policy for the middle class. One of the conclusions that they reached after traveling to Minnesota and Iowa and Ohio and Colorado was that most people in the United States aren't clamoring for a cosmic clash with China. They're not sitting around the barbecue pit wondering how we're going to prevail over China. Yes, China is doing things that are deeply concerning to us and that have a direct impact on our interests and our ambitions. But there are more and less effective ways to deal with that. And the part of the argument that I'm trying to offer in the book is that for American policy towards China to be effective, it needs to be seen as durable and sustainable by the Chinese. Otherwise, they will just try to wait out until the next administration. In order for it to feel durable and sustainable, it needs to be reflective of the views, priorities, and pain tolerances of the American people. But it also needs to have some relationship to the priorities and concerns of our allies and partners. Because otherwise, we will isolate ourselves in the process of trying to pursue a relationship with China.
Yeah, I agree. And they talk a lot about, the Biden administration talks a lot about a foreign policy and a trade policy for the working class. What troubles me is the people most punished by our tariffs are the working class. So if you're, rich and your bill at Walmart goes up $800, you kind of go, whatever, that doesn't matter. If you're making $25,000, $30,000 a year and your bill goes up $800 at Walmart, you got to decide, do I not buy the shoes? Do I not buy the pants? Do I not buy the shirt? Do I not buy the books for my kids? We need a policy that's responsive, not only in name, but in substance to the concerns of the working class. And so far, again, I am with you 100%. Know these people, they're good, they're not ideological, but we need to move. We need to move. So last question. Do you think, I always go back to Eisenhower's speech, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. He worried a lot about the military industrial, what he then called congressional complex, which then congressional got dropped from the speech. Is this playing a role kind of in our inability to get a nuanced message out about China? Are there people who benefit from demonizing China?
Well, there are people who are deeply worried and anxious about China and what China represents and the threat that they perceive that China poses to the United States. I don't necessarily want to get into the business of questioning their patriotism or their intentions. I will simply say that I don't think that's the most productive path for us to take. We want to be in a position where China is responding to us and we are building on our own strengths rather than getting into some deep clash, because the reality is that we will not be able to impose our will on China any more than China is going to be able to impose their will upon us. We also don't need to defeat China in order to protect ourselves. We need to live up to our values. We need to live up to our potential. We need to take care of our people and help them unlock their talents. The more that we can do that, I'm confident that we'll be just fine in our ability to compete with China.
This has the fastest hour and 5 minutes I've experienced in a long time. This gives you a taste of what is in this fabulous book, an absolute must read, Stronger. I think our office has posted the link to how to get it, but it really, if you're interested in U.S. China relations, it's a must read. And it's a fair reflection of really one of the great scholars on U.S. China relations today. And I should say, Nippon Shirwa Fine. See, the next generation is well represented by Ryan, and we did coordinate our outfits today. So we both wore blue blazers and blue shirts. I see everyone who started on this call stayed to the end. But Ryan, thank you for being such a voice of reason on U.S. China relations. Thanks for reading the book, and thanks for writing the book, and thanks for participating in our program.
Thank you, Steve. The thanks belong from me to you. Thank you.